Congressman Khanna, thanks for joining me on UpFront. On Monday night, the US Congress voted for the first time to condemn US involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen by 366 to 30 on a resolution you co-sponsored. But what actual difference will that non-binding congressional vote have for the people of Yemen who are dying right now, both under a blockade imposed by a Saudi-led coalition and under US-made bombs that the Saudis are dropping on them? What difference will that vote make?
Well, I was very pleased that Chairman Royce, during the debate, said that this resolution will put pressure on the Saudis to provide humanitarian access. And it's a sense of the House resolution, so you're right, it's not binding. But if the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as the chairman said he would, uses this and goes to the Saudis and says, look, if you don't make changes and provide more humanitarian access for basic food, for basic medicine, then you're going to have a Congress that's going to exercise even greater oversight. That's going to make a difference. That can at least save lives.
So on that note about putting pressure on Congress shifting positions, since the Second World War, the United States has been a very close ally of Saudi Arabia, whether under Democrat or Republican administrations. But is it fair to say that there's a split right now within the US government between a Trump-led White House, which is 100%, 110% behind the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and a Congress, a Republican-led Congress, in fact, that is growing more and more skeptical of this alliance with Saudi Arabia, at least in terms of arms sales, the military component of it?
There is a growing sense that our intervention in the Middle East has made us less safe, that we ought not to be aligned with the Saudi war crimes in other areas and associated with that. And so you actually have this odd alliance among progressives in Congress and some in the Freedom Caucus who are questioning the neocon, neoliberal paradigm of foreign policy and questioning what are we getting out of this relationship.
You briefly served in a previous US administration, the Obama administration, which backed the Saudi war on Yemen, which long before Trump arrived on the scene, the Obama administration was providing refueling to Saudi jets, targeting assistance, arms sales, diplomatic cover at the UN. So the Obama administration, your party, the Democrats in general, they don't have clean hands when it comes to Saudi Arabia or the war in Yemen, do they?
Right. I think he was morally conflicted. It was not something I agreed with. I mean, it's a decision that I have said was wrong. I don't think it had the Trump level of enthusiasm, and Obama always had this sense.
Yes, but if you're a Yemeni being killed by US-made bombs dropped by Saudi or UAE jets, you're not going to say, well, these bombs are less enthusiastically dropped under Obama than they were under Trump. True. You're still going to lose your life as a result of President Obama or President Trump.
True, but I think that the bombing has escalated a great deal, and that civilian casualties have escalated, and the blockade has been strengthened. And so the humanitarian crisis, I think, is of a different proportion than when President Obama left office. That said, I'm not trying to say that the decision that President Obama made was right. I think he was talked into, or his administration was talked into this view that we have to view Saudi as a counter to Iran. And if we're bridging relations with Iran, then what are we going to do for Saudi Arabia? And I just don't see the world that way.
Do you think it was a mistake to back that war?
It was absolutely a mistake.
So today, do you believe the US is complicit in Saudi war crimes in Yemen?
Today, I believe that we are aiding Saudi Arabia in Saudi Arabia's committing war crimes.
Do you believe that was the case under President Obama as well?
I imagine that Saudi was still committing war crimes, but I don't think it was at the scale that it is today. And I think if President Obama were in office today and he saw 1 million people who had suffering from cholera and the Saudis closing the ports, closing the Sana'a airport, not allowing chlorine tablets to get into civilians, that he would be outraged and he would put pressure on the Saudis.
The Saudis would say that over the decades they have been a loyal friend to the US. They have helped provide stability in the region, make sure the oil keeps flowing, provided intel on terrorist groups, invested in the US economy. And so their US critics, people like yourself, are ungrateful or unappreciative of that relationship.
Well, first of all, 15 of the terrorists who attacked us come from Saudi Arabia. Wahhabism is one of the largest exporters of violence and non-pluralism to the world. There are ties between Saudi Arabia and terrorist groups. So to argue that they've been a voice for peace or a strong ally is very questionable. I think what they say is that they are a counter to Iran, and they are a counter to Iran's dominance in the Middle East, and that's usually the argument they make. And I just don't view the U.S. engaging in balance of power politics as something that has helped.
Why do you think the U.S. is so close to not just to Saudi Arabia, but all of the Gulf kingdoms, none of them democracies? Is it just a need for cheap oil and gas, or is it something else? Is it something more?
I think it goes back to the Kissinger view of realpolitik, balance of power politics, even in Europe. And we say if there's a rising power, we need to check that rising power. That's the essence of balance of power politics. And it's gotten us into trouble when we armed Saddam Hussein because we feared Iran. I mean, there's almost this single focus on making sure Iran isn't dominant in the region. And we view, I think, Saudis as a check on Iranian expansion.
Given the strength of the pro-Saudi lobby here in Washington, D.C., is there any chance that these congressional votes critical of the kingdom, the lawsuits against the Saudis by the 9/11 victims, the much more critical U.S. media coverage of the kingdom in recent years, that any of that will actually translate into a more tougher stance by the U.S. government on the issue of Saudi Arabia?
I do. For the first time, the military realizes that Congress is really scrutinizing what's going on in Yemen. I think there's no longer this carte blanche. And now the chairman, Ed Royce, who is a hardliner on Iran, for him to go on the House floor and say this resolution is going to give us leverage to make sure that the Saudis are at least providing humanitarian access, leads me to believe that behind closed doors, some people are going to say to the Saudis, look, we have had your back, but if you continue to embarrass us by creating appalling headlines of 900,000 folks and kids with cholera, you're going to lose public opinion.
There's been much talk this week of conflict and crisis in the Middle East, especially with the resignation of the Lebanese Prime Minister, allegedly on the orders of the Saudi Crown Prince, the rocket attack on Riyadh by the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are backed by Iran. If the Saudis and/or Israel decide to launch an attack on Iran, what should be the U.S. response in your view?
We should condemn it, and we should certainly not come to their defense if they are perpetrating an attack on Iran. I think that would be a declaration of war on their part, unjustified.
There would be U.S. allies who would then presumably be under counterattack from Iran. You're saying the U.S. should not come to the help of its allies if they start a war with Iran?
Certainly not Saudi Arabia, no. I don't think that because it would be not a just war. And we've had precedent.
You'd protect Israel, but not Saudi Arabia.
Well, it depends on it depends on what the response was. I mean, obviously, if Iran starts to say we're going to annihilate Israel, then we have to defend it. But I don't expect that to be the response. I expect it to be proportional. And I don't think Israel will go and start declaring war on Iran. I think their cooler heads and savvier heads will prevail. And we certainly would not condone a strike on Iran by either Saudi Arabia or Israel.
And do you worry about a war like that happening, given recent events? How worried are you?
Well, Salman strikes me as not smart. And, you know, Napoleon once said worse than a crime is a blunder. And Salman strikes me as a blunder.
You're talking about King Salman or his son, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince?
Yeah, the Crown Prince. Yeah. And so I worry because he doesn't have... he's not judicious and he's not prudent, and he may do things that ultimately aren't even in his country's interest, which usually cause war. And that's my concern. But it would be utter folly for him to start a direct war with Iran.
And one last question. You, like many people in the West, have criticized the Saudi ruling family for its lack of democracy, lack of transparency, its failure to guarantee gender equality, minority rights. But don't you have to be careful what you wish for? Many would say that if this Saudi government were to fall, were it to be toppled from power, it might just be replaced by something more extreme, more brutal, more anti-American.
Well, I think this is the type of thinking, though, that has gotten the United States in trouble, this idea that we can somehow manage populations and install our own in our own governments. But I think that what would happen if we didn't intervene there would be a sense by the people that the United States is not a cause of their suffering or a cause of interventionism that they resent. And I think having a more restrained foreign policy, speaking out about human rights. I mean, if there was a change of a regime in Saudi Arabia and they were still oppressing women or they were still committing war crimes, we should continue to speak out and speak out with moral clarity. But I don't think we should be in the business of determining regimes in foreign countries.
Congressman Khanna, thanks for joining me on Upfront.
Thank you.